A man with an 8th grade education described the bottom of the Atlantic in 1933. Edgar Cayce never visited a university, never held a medical license, never studied geology or archaeology. But between 1901 and 1945, while in self-induced trances in a small office in Virginia Beach, he dictated over 14,000 readings that touched on subjects he had no formal training in: medicine, ancient civilizations, planetary movements, seismic activity, the structure of the atom. Most of it sounded like fantasy. Most of it was dismissed. But researchers are now seeing patterns in geological records, satellite imagery, and deep ocean topography that align disturbingly well with things Cayce said when the technology to verify them didn't even exist yet. If you want to see where this leads, subscribe now, because what comes next gets stranger. In 1934, Cayce described a vast submerged landmass in the Atlantic near the Bahamas, with temples and roads made of stone, remnants of what he called Atlantis. He said portions of it would begin to rise again near Bimini in 1968 or 1969. In 1968, a pilot named Robert Brush photographed straight-line formations underwater off the coast of Bimini, massive limestone blocks arranged in geometric patterns, later called the Bimini Road. Archaeologists initially dismissed it as natural beach rock. But in 2005, Eugene Shin of the U.S. Geological Survey dated samples and found they were far older than typical beach rock formation would allow. In 2020, further sonar mapping revealed additional symmetrical structures deeper in the same region. The formations are still debated, but their existence, their location, and their timing match what Cayce said 34 years before anyone looked. He also said the Earth's poles would shift not suddenly but gradually, through a process tied to volcanic pressure and melting ice. In 1936, he described rising instability in the crust near the poles and claimed the shifting weight of ice would trigger realignments over decades. At the time, plate tectonics was not yet accepted science. Continental drift was still considered fringe. But in 1998, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory confirmed that melting ice in Greenland and Antarctica was redistributing enough mass to measurably affect Earth's rotational axis. In 2016, scientists at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center published findings showing the planet's spin axis had shifted by nearly 10 centimeters per year since 2000, driven primarily by ice loss and shifting water mass. The mechanism Cayce described, a slow tilt caused by uneven ice distribution, was no longer speculative. Then there were his medical readings. Cayce prescribed specific treatments for illnesses he'd never studied, often while unconscious. In one 1927 reading, he recommended using belladonna and a mixture of ash for a tuberculosis patient, a treatment that wouldn't be medically recognized until the antibiotic era, when alkaloid compounds from plants were synthesized. In another case in 1931, he suggested a patient suffering from psoriasis eliminate nightshades from their diet and apply castor oil compresses to the abdomen. At the time, the link between gut inflammation and autoimmune skin conditions was unknown. But by the 2000s, gastroenterologists had identified what they now call the gut-skin axis, a biological pathway connecting intestinal permeability with inflammatory skin diseases. In 2017, a study published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine showed castor oil's ricinoleic acid had measurable anti-inflammatory effects on immune cells. Cayce had been suggesting it 80 years earlier, but the reading that made scientists pause the longest came in 1932. Cayce said that in the distant past, Atlantis had developed a form of energy technology based on crystals that could store and transmit power wirelessly, and that this system, misused, contributed to catastrophic geological instability. It sounded like pure myth. But in 2012, a team at MIT demonstrated wireless energy transfer using resonant inductive coupling, transmitting power across a room without wires. In 2018, researchers at the University of Sussex used ultrasonic waves and crystals to levitate and manipulate objects, a form of acoustic energy control. In 2021, scientists in Japan successfully harvested energy from piezoelectric crystals embedded in infrastructure. None of this proves Atlantis existed, but the core principle that crystalline structures can store, convert, and transmit energy has become established physics. Cayce described it as ancient technology. We now call it materials science. He said the records of Atlantis would be found in 3 places: near the Sphinx in Egypt and the Yucatan, and in the Atlantic near Bimini. In 1995, a Japanese team using ground-penetrating radar discovered a large, previously unknown chamber beneath the left paw of the Sphinx. Egyptian authorities blocked further exploration, citing preservation concerns. In 1998, archaeologists using LiDAR in the Yucatan jungle uncovered thousands of previously hidden Mayan structures, many aligned in ways that suggested a far older and more extensive civilization than was believed. In 2013, further sonar work near Bimini mapped additional angular formations and possible building remnants deeper than recreational divers can reach. The sites are there. Whether they are what Cayce said, they were remains unsettled. But he named the locations 70 years before the technology existed to look. In 1939, Cayce predicted that a portion of Japan would go into the sea. He also said that Northern Europe would change suddenly, and that lands would appear in the Atlantic and Pacific. At the time, it sounded apocalyptic and vague. But in 2011, the Tohoku earthquake shifted Japan's main island by 8 feet and dropped sections of the coastline by more than 2 feet, submerging land that had been inhabited. In 2019, researchers studying tectonic activity along the mid-Atlantic ridge confirmed that new seafloor was being created through volcanic activity, effectively generating new landmass, albeit slowly and underwater. In 2020, a volcanic eruption near Tonga created a new island that remained above sea level for several months. Cayce didn't predict the exact events, but he described the process, a dynamic, shifting Earth with rising and sinking land masses, in an era when most people still believed the continents were static. He also described what he called the body's spiritual centers, which he mapped to 7 glands: pineal, pituitary, thyroid, thymus, adrenal, Leiden, and gonads. He said these glands were not just biological, but energetic focal points that affected consciousness. Medical science in the 1930s knew almost nothing about the pineal gland's function. But in 1958, researchers discovered that the pineal produces melatonin, which regulates circadian rhythms. In 2002, studies showed the pineal contains photoreceptive cells similar to those in the retina. In 2019, neuroscientists at Johns Hopkins found that the pineal gland responds to electromagnetic fields and may play a role in spatial awareness and perception beyond the 5 senses. Cayce had called it the seat of the soul and tied it to intuition, dreams, and spiritual perception. Science hasn't confirmed the spiritual part, but the gland's sensitivity to light magnetism and altered states is now documented. He said that in 1958, a new spiritual awakening would begin, marked by discoveries that bridged science and spirit. In 1958, the laser was invented, opening new fields in physics and medicine. In the same year, the first integrated circuit was created, sparking the digital revolution. In 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed, making Antarctica a preserve for scientific research, which led to decades of climate and ice core studies that reshaped our understanding of Earth's history. Cayce hadn't been specific about what the awakening would look like, but the late 1950s did mark a turning point, a moment when humanity's tools for seeing became exponentially sharper. In one reading from 1934, Cayce said that human consciousness affects physical reality more than we believe, that focused thought can alter outcomes not just psychologically but materially. This was dismissed as mysticism. But in 1982, physicist Alain Aspect confirmed quantum entanglement in the lab, showing that observation affects the behavior of particles. In 2011, Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences conducted double-slit experiments showing measurable interference pattern changes correlated with focused attention. The results were small, controversial, and endlessly debated. But the idea that consciousness interfaces with matter is no longer laughable in quantum mechanics. It's unresolved. Cayce also warned about environmental collapse if humanity continued to ignore the balance between industry and nature. He said the Earth would respond with violent weather, rising oceans and earthquakes not as punishment, but as consequence. In 1936, this was not mainstream concern, but since 2000, the frequency of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes has increased. Arctic sea ice has declined by over 40% since 1979. Seismic activity in tectonically sensitive zones has intensified. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake shifted the Earth's axis by nearly 3 inches. The 2000 10 chilly earthquake moved it again. Scientists now openly discuss feedback loops. Melting ice reducing albedo, permafrost releasing methane, ocean warming accelerating glacier loss. Cayce called it imbalance. We call it climate change. The language differs. The pattern doesn't. But the strangest part of the Cayce readings isn't the geology or the medicine. It's the specificity. He didn't speak in vague metaphors. He gave dates, locations, mechanisms, names. He said Atlantis sank in 3 stages, the last around 10,000 BC. He said the Hall of Records would be found before the end of the 20th century. He said souls reincarnate in cycles, drawn back to places they'd lived before, which is why certain regions attract people repeatedly. He said that by 2100, the Earth's climate and geography would be radically different. But humanity would survive if it learned cooperation. He offered no proof. He cited no sources. He just spoke while unconscious in a rural Virginia office, and stenographers took it all down. Most of it is still unverified. Some of it may never be. But 7 of his claims about underwater formations near Bimini, about polar shift mechanisms, about the gut-skin medical connection, about crystal-based energy principles, about seismic activity in Japan, about the pineal gland sensitivity, and about the timing of technological breakthroughs in the late 1950s, have moved from the fringe into documented scientific reality, not as exact matches, but as undeniable overlaps. The rest of his predictions remain in that quiet space where data ends and interpretation begins. We have the sonar. We have the ice core samples. We have the satellite readings. We don't yet have the context that makes sense of what Cayce said he was seeing. Maybe he was guessing. Maybe he was reading unconscious patterns in the collective information field. Maybe he was accessing something we still don't have instruments for. But the ocean floor near Bimini is still being mapped, and every year, the images get clearer.